Today, I am here in downtown St. Petersburg, standing on what was once 916 Central Avenue, the historic grounds of the Center Theater. I've always been fascinated in the role that movie theaters play in shaping society and culture. For many people, the movie theater wasn't just a space for entertainment, it was often their first exposure to cultures and stories beyond their own community. Yet in the American South, these spaces were also sites of exclusion, where racial minorities were often denied access, reinforcing the idea that not everyone was allowed to participate in the broader cultural conversation. During our Journey Towards Justice trip to Alabama, a classmate and I had the opportunity to attend a jazz performance at Birmingham's historic Carver Theater. As one of the few theaters that welcomed Black audiences during segregation, the Carver holds a significant place in Alabama's civil rights history. Inspired by the story of the Carver Theater, I felt compelled to explore the history of theaters in my hometown of St. Petersburg and uncover the roles that they played during the civil rights movement. This led me to this document, a letter from the field director of the Florida branch of the NAACP, Robert W. Saunders, to the director of branch's Gloucester B. Current. This letter and the subsequent article in the St. Petersburg Times lays out an incident where on January 19, 1962, 10 members of the NAACP's Youth Council, aged 17 to 22, attempted to buy tickets for a movie at the all-white Center Theater in downtown St. Petersburg. After being denied access, they continued to file through the theater line as the manager for the theater met them and physically tried to remove them from the theater. Though none of the youth demonstrated any violence, all 10 students were arrested for disorderly conduct with a bond set at $500 per person. St. Petersburg, like mostly every other city in the South, allowed racial segregation in public places, but that didn't mean that there weren't efforts to desegregate, especially in certain businesses and institutions. Some restaurants and lunch counters around the city began opening their doors to Black customers around the early 1960s, and many city institutions such as the St. Petersburg City Museum, Library, and city parks fully desegregated by 1962. However, mostly every other business in St. Petersburg enforced segregation, and by 1962, schools had not widely been integrated. Desegregation efforts mostly came through the work of local civil rights groups such as the NAACP and CORE. These groups launched selective buying campaigns, orchestrated meetings with business owners and city officials, and planned demonstrations to accomplish the desegregation of St. Petersburg. Many of these demonstrations would involve the NAACP's Youth Council, a group of students who would be integral in getting public attention onto desegregation efforts across the city. On December 4, 1961, St. Petersburg's Congress on Racial Equality established a committee to oversee efforts to end segregation in the prominent downtown theaters. Their first move was to secure a meeting with the downtown theater managers. The following week, a meeting with the local theater manager of 3 downtown theaters resulted in the advising of passing along a letter to someone higher up by the authority to make changes. The committee would go on to meet with a total of 4 downtown theater managers, with only one positioning themselves against the proposal of integrated theaters. However, there were no efforts to desegregate the theaters in the ensuing month. CORE Field Secretary Richard Haley wrote that, quote, "The next move could be a simultaneous picketing of theaters in this chain by CORE and or the NAACP youth councils in Miami, St. Petersburg, Tampa, and Jacksonville." The goal of this demonstration would be to demand public attention onto the ongoing racial discrimination in St. Petersburg's movie theaters. Starting on January 9, 1962, members of the Youth Council, with the guidance of St. Petersburg's NAACP chapter president Leon Cox, began demonstrations at the downtown theaters. Throughout the following attempts, the managers of the theaters strictly upheld segregation at the establishments, not allowing members of the Youth Council to buy tickets for showings. On the night of the 19th, the Center Theater was set to screen King of Kings. Due to the recurring demonstrations, a 3-foot barricade blocked the entrance to the theater. Around 7:30 p.m., the chain that barred the entrance was removed to allow a line of white people to enter the theater. Capitalizing on the opportunity, members of the Youth Council rushed in behind the white patrons and scaled the barricade to approach the ticket booth in hopes of buying a ticket for the movie. They were met by ushers and the theater manager, who physically tried to remove them. Helmeted members of the police's riot squad moved in, arresting the 10 students, even though it was reported that there was no violence demonstrated by the Youth Council members. The students were released on a $500 bond per person with a trial set on January 31st. At the trial, Municipal Judge Henry Esteva initially fined the defendants $50 each, but he later suspended the fines when the attorney for the case promised that the harassment would cease. The students were given suspended sentences with the provision that they do not further attempt to stand in at downtown theaters. While the ruling only pertained to the 10 defendants, the NAACP, almost bankrupted by the legal fees, could not afford to continue the demonstrations. The events that unfolded on January 19th marked the end of the demonstrations by the NAACP at the St. Petersburg theaters, and these would not see desegregation at least until the summer of 1963. The Center Theater closed its doors for the last time on March 28, 1974, a full 10 years after federal desegregation. Today, a parking lot for the surrounding businesses holds its place. Many other once segregated theaters met the same fate, as for white audiences who had previously relied on these theaters as safe, segregated spaces, there was no longer a perceived need to maintain them once integration allowed access to newer, suburban venues. Meanwhile, many black theaters lacked the economic investment to stay in business. While the direct effort to desegregate St. Petersburg's downtown theaters may have seemed to end in frustration, it was far from a failure. What these local demonstrations revealed was the enormous amount of courage, strategy, and sacrifice required to challenge even a single thread in the fabric of Jim Crow. The goal, gaining entry into a movie theater, may seem small in isolation, but it represented a much larger fight for dignity, visibility, and equal citizenship. As people who hope to create change, I think we can take away some very powerful lessons from the story of the theater desegregation efforts in St. Petersburg. The young demonstrators, many still students, didn't wait for ideal conditions or widespread support. Instead, they organized, planned strategically, and took bold public action. The work reminds us that change often begins with small local acts of courage, but also that a lot of work goes into these small efforts. Months of planning, coordinating, and organizing contributed to the micro-movement that was the efforts to desegregate St. Petersburg's theaters. On top of this, the Center Theater was only one of 3 whites-only theaters in St. Petersburg. Theaters in general were only one of hundreds of institutions which upheld segregation in the city. There was a stark contrast between the size of what was being asked, access to a movie theater, and the size of what was being required to ask for it: careful coordination, coalition building, legal defense, and risking arrest. It is this disparity that makes change so difficult to grasp. When a system is built against your very existence, the odds are stacked high, and the structures of injustice seem immovable. It can make these fights seem impossible. But by examining the struggle to desegregate St. Petersburg's downtown theaters, we see a different kind of truth emerge. That through shared purpose, organized community, and the courage to persist, change can be chipped away at, even when it's slow, incomplete, or unrecognized in the moment. The efforts of CORE, the NAACP, and the Youth Council may not have immediately desegregated those theaters, but their work contributed to a larger conversation about the need for desegregation, as well as to the movement that reshaped the moral and legal landscape of the country. Their story teaches us that progress doesn't always come in sweeping, headline-making victories. Sometimes it comes in the quiet resolve of a few determined individuals who believe that even something as seemingly simple as entering a theater can be a step towards justice.